Welcome to this webinar on counting birds. And it's really great to see so many familiar faces and mostly familiar names, and also many new people. So hopefully this will be of help to everyone. So why do we count birds? When we go on these birding walks, upload a checklist on eBird, etc., we always prompted for a count. Why is it that a count is so important? And we just don't mention that we have seen this bird. That's because counting birds gives us essential information, really important information, both for our own knowledge, as well as something that is critical to be able to monitor bird abundance. Uh, and this is only by monitoring abundance and seeing how numbers of birds have changed over time can we be able to help with conservation here. So by monitoring the counts of a particular species over time, we can find out whether it's increasing or decreasing, and what the status of the conservation status of the bird is. And therefore, we can give recommendations. So for a citizen science initiative like eBird, it's important that these counts are noted, because now this is the information that people are using to be able to decide on conservation action. So if you're finding 1,000 flamingos in a lake today and 500 3 years from now, that's an indication that the number of flamingos in that lake might be declining, and therefore something might have to be done. It's also really important for being able to identify sites of importance. If a particular site has, say, something like 1% of the global population of a bird, of a waterfowl or a wader, then that site becomes of global conservation importance. And using that, there can be focused measures that help conserve a particular site. So counting birds is important for two reasons. One is to be able to monitor counts over time, monitor numbers over time, and to find out sites that are of particular importance for that species. Next. So when you're counting on a trail, the general birding that we do is, say, along a trail in a forest, or some agricultural area, or even alongside a wetland. In a wetland, when you have some habitat on both sides, you're always counting birds when you travel. Here you encounter multiple individuals of these birds. So there is while you're doing other things, while you're watching birds, while you're, let's say, taking photographs, it becomes difficult to keep track of what you have. So at the end of this entire count, you might be tempted to say, okay, I'm not really sure how many birds we saw. So in the checklist, you end up putting X. But now this X, while it's better than not putting anything, X becomes very uninformative. An X can mean one, and X can even mean a million. So when there are X's in checklists, there is some essential information that is lacking in those checklists that can later help with help in many ways. So next question. So general counting, when you're walking along a trail, you're counting individuals one by one. Sometimes you see flocks, and you're not just counting one after the other, but you're counting flocks. So let's say you see one individual, and then you see 5 individuals of a species. So what you have is 1 plus 5 there as you go along the track. But there are many difficulties. There are many problems when you're counting birds along a track. Next question. Some birds are not seen. You're not always seeing these birds. So what are you doing in such cases? The important thing here is to count both birds that you're hearing and you're seeing. So if you are walking along a track and you hear a Blythe-Reed warbler, and then about 10 meters later, you hear another Blythe-Reed warbler. Now your count should be 2. Only if you see just the third Blythe-Reed warbler and you've heard the previous 2, your count should be 3. So it's really important to note down everything that you're hearing as well as seeing. So it's a combination of the two that is important. So now when you're using the app, there is a very easy way for you to be able to note down all of this. So again, Blythe-Reed warbler here. You can use these codes, and if you go to the Bird Count India YouTube channel, you'll be able to find a video that explains how to use these species codes. So Blight's reed warbler is just with these 4 letters, you can get to the species. And this is really useful because there are many other distractions, as I said, while birding. You have co-participants. There are many species at a time. You might be focusing on certain things. So to be able to enter a species with a code of this sort makes it easy to do it on field. So when you put Blythe's reed warbler, you can note down one. Let's say I hear the first Blythe's reed warbler. But now the next time I hear a Blythe's reed warbler, I don't have to click on it and keep increasing. You see the plus sign here? If you keep clicking on the plus sign, you can add more individuals. But what if you see a really large number the next time? And the next time you see more than that. So again, the app has a way for you to be able to increment as you go along. So after your first Blythe's reed warbler, let's say you hear 2 more Blythe's reed warblers nearby. So then what you're doing after that is you can put 2 BRWA, and if you click on the species, it will add 2 to it and it will become 3. Similarly, the next time if you see 5 Blythe-thread warblers in an area, in which case you can put 5 BRWA and click on the species that shows up, and then you get 5 added to 3, and then it becomes 8 Blythe-thread warblers. So this is an easy way to count, to increment along a trail by using the app. Now there are, as I said, there are some problems when you're walking these trails. There are some things that make counting very difficult. Here
Hello.
here you see a photo of a pitta. Pitta is a bird which has a call that can travel a large distance. Sometimes when you've walked along a trail, you don't know whether the pitta that you're hearing is already a pitta that you've counted previously. Let's say maybe 20 or 30 meters down the line. It might even feel like it's coming from a slightly different direction, but that might be because you've moved. So this is something very important to keep in mind while you're walking a trail, to try and ensure that you're not double counting a species with a loud call. And the way to do this, the best report birds of this sort is to be as conservative as possible. Unless you're completely certain that it's another individual, do not increase the count. The presentation.
Sorry. I'll try to share it again. It got disconnected.
Yes,
Sorry.
please.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah. Okay. Pitta flew away. Yes. So it's important to be conservative, to ensure that you're not repeating a particular bird, and there are some ways to help you along this process. There are some ways. For example, when a species like a pitta calls, you often have another one responding. So with that, you can pinpoint the location of another bird that may have called, and as you go further down, you'll be able to tell whether it's that bird that's calling or a completely new one. So these are some ways you can tell whether you're double counting or not. But it's important to be aware of this. Next one, Kaushik. Okay, so there are some best practices here. Increment as you go along the trail. Do not wait for the end of the track to decide on what the number of birds is for a particular species. So keep noting down. If you have a notebook, it's useful to put put tally marks and count. If you have the app, you can directly count as you go along, because otherwise it becomes really difficult to keep count as you at the end of the track. If you're going up a track and you're coming down that same track, do not count that same species again unless you're completely sure that it's a new bird. So this is really important. Often when we go birding, we go along a track and we come back along the same track. And when you're doing that, if you're going to recount all the birds that you have seen or heard as you went along the track for the first time, that's going to be double counting, because you're counting the same individual more than once. So in such cases, make sure that you do not count any bird that you're not sure is a new individual. If you're doing this for a species like Ashiprinia or Blythe-thread warbler, it's very likely that you've detected most birds already along the path. But if you have something like, let's say, a booted eagle, you've seen a white booted eagle, and the next time when you're coming along, you see a dark mouth-booted eagle, you can be sure that, okay, this is a different bird, although you're walking along the same track. So this is important to keep in mind. If you have already counted a particular species in one direction, do not count it unless you find clearly a new individual in the other direction. Be conservative with counts, and also treat calls, what you hear and what you see, both with the same importance. But ensure that you're not counting. If you've heard a bird and you see a bird in the same place, it's very likely the same bird. So do not count that as two. So here I'm talking about counting along a track, counting birds that are not in big flocks. What do you do when you see large flocks of birds? There, the entire way you count birds changes. And Kaushik will take you through that. And I'll answer any questions about this later in the presentation.
Kaushik?
Can't hear you, Kaushik.
Kaushik, are you there?
Sorry, my audio was muted while I was sharing video. So can that be maintained?
Yeah, you are
Wait.
audible now. You can share.
Okay, wait. Let me see if I can.
Yeah. Kaushik, you are muted again.
Sorry, something is happening while I'm sharing the screen. I'm being muted. So, maybe Ashwin can share his screen. And
I can share. Mithal, can you enable that?
You should be able to do it, Ashwin, because you. Okay. Let me just... Yeah. Try now, Ashwin.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Okay, Kaushik.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Can I move to the next slide? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure. Thanks. Sorry for the disruption. So here we will try to learn about how to count of flocks of single species. Many of the times when we encounter them, we are overwhelmed by their numbers. And it becomes difficult task to actually come out with a proper number. But through this process, we'll try to see what best we can do. So suppose we encounter one small flock. It's the most easy one to go.
Kaushik, you're muted.
We can count one by one by one. So like in this particular, I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we lost you in between, but yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay. Can you see me?
Yes.
Can you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we are encountering a flock, if it's a small one, we can count them one by one, simply. In this particular photograph, we can see 9 Tibetan sand grosses all together, and we can count them easily. Next slide, please. But when we encounter a larger flock, it's best to divide it into certain segments. In a particular flock, we can see there are certain subunits among them. If we count those particular subunits separately, and then we can add them together, we can find a total number. For example, in this image bird specifically, there are 3 segments. On 2 segments, there are 2 scaly-breasted minias together. On the middle one, there are about 7 of the individuals. So we can say there are 11 scaly-breasted minias in this flock. So that's a small, when we encounter smaller flocks, we can do this and we can count numbers. But what we encounter a larger number. So then we'll have to keep counting in larger denominators. Say it's a bigger flock. Then our counting turns into counting by tens. So in this particular photograph of small pratincoles, we are sitting on a ledge on a mud bund. So you can see how many of this flock constitute.
Kaushik, we can't hear you now.
Maybe it's some internet issue.
Yeah, looks like. I think he logged out.
Okay, maybe I'll take it forward. I
Yeah.
think he's facing some
Can
internet
you hear
problem.
me? Can you hear me again? Sorry.
Yeah,
Yes,
now we can hear
yeah.
you.
Yeah. So in this particular slide, we can see the box numbers comprises half of the flock. So we can estimate this total flock would consist roughly of 20 small pratincoles. Can you move to the next slide? So by this method, we can count similar numbered flocks. For example, in this image, there is a flock of Indian spot-billed ducks. Can the audience give a try about how many ducks would be there in this flock? Please type in your messages in the chat box. Try to count it by tens, which will make it easier.
Okay, so we are getting answers as 28, 15, 27, 22,
Nice.
25, 24, more 25s.
Great. Most of the people are pretty close to the accurate number. Can you move to the next slide, Ashwin? The total number is 27. So that was a pretty good guess. Now there's another example of Eurasian griffin, a larger flock. Here, probably you'll need to go by the tens rule. In the previous slide, you might be able to count them just by counting heads. Because it's a more clumped group, you'll rather want to take a tens count. So what's your estimate on this one, guys?
Quite a wide range.
Yeah. See, from the numbers I can see in the chat box, I can feel like there's a lot of error which comes in when the flock size increases. And that's when we have to be a little more conservative. Or also we have to think what proportion of the flock does a 10 form. And we also to check about where the densest parts are. So if we can move to the next slide, we'll know the true numbers. These are 40. I saw someone posting 40 in the chat box. So congratulations to him or her. So yes, so larger flocks produce a challenge to us. But we also have to figure, the aim is to get closest as possible. We might not be able to, but that's the aim. Can you move to the next slide? So suppose we are encountering an even larger flock. If you're in Bangalore, you will see glossy ibises flying over our heads in the evenings, and they come in huge numbers. So then our denominator also increases. Rather than 10, we start counting by 30s. So by counting by 30s, we can have a rough idea of how huge the flock is. Can we move to the next slide, Ashwin? So in this flock, there are at least 3 segments which contain 30 birds each, roughly. And apart from them, there are 20 odd other individuals. So the rough count of this total flock is around 110. So that's how you deal with larger flocks. Can you move to the next slide? Now, if you encounter a huge flock where even you're not able to comprehend what is 30, what is 10, and it will take a huge amount of time to count them. And it's also not possible to count them because the flock is also keeps on moving, or it's changing, or its formation is changing. They're not evenly distributed. So we try to take the largest denominator as possible, which will give us rough counts, which would be acceptable. So I guess 100 is a count which is most acceptable denominator when we move around larger flocks. So the closest number roughly is taken as hundreds. So if we move to the next slide.
So to clarify, even to reach this 100, to find a block of 100 in the flock, you might need to count in tens to reach there.
Yeah.
So that's usually what's helpful. You start from 1, go to 10, and then from 10, go to 100. And these are numbers that we use usually because they're easy to scale. It's easy to add hundreds and it's easy to add tens. So you pick out a block that is approximately 100. And then you move on and find out how many such blocks are there.
Yeah, so in this particular flock, there are roughly 1,000 individuals or small pattern calls. So if you see that 100, of course, the densities changes in certain blocks, but overall for the estimate, we are happy to consider it as a flock of 1,000. There might be 50, 60 odd plus minus, but we are just trying to get closest to it. And when we are dealing with a flock, which is 1,000 odd strong, so this much error is acceptable. But our aim is again to get closest as possible. If you get an image, you can count them off. So that you can do by using grids or blocks. Can you move to the next slide? If you have a smaller flock, maybe just divide it into certain blocks, and then you count the number of individuals within each block. And with that, you can get a fairly accurate account. Can you move to the next slide? So in this particular image, we can see there are 41 great cormorants. We just counted each of the block and counted the number of individuals in them. And in total, we get a total count, which is much more accurate. Can we move to the next slide? And if you have a bigger flock, which is again in huge numbers and it's not even distributed, you can just grid the whole image up. Or however you see your landscape, a camera can actually save a day for most of us when we encounter huge flocks. But even when you're encountering the bird in field, try to divide your whole view into certain grids and count the birds in them. That would be helpful to get a more accurate account.
If you have something like ducks, for example, if you have ducks spread out over a lake, try and divide the lake in your mind to equal sized parts and count each of those parts separately, and that helps.
Yes.
And within that, counting in, if you can break it down into groups of 100, that might be helpful.
Yeah. Can we move to the next slide? So now, when we encounter a wetland where a lot of waterfowls come, especially in winters where a lot of migration happens, or even in some places like Mumbai where there are huge aggregations of lesser flamingos, that's when we see the birds in a three-dimensional view. And that's when the counting becomes very difficult because the father of birds are more concentrated while the birds which are closer to us are more sparse. So then we have to count the birds keeping distance in mind. Can we move to the next slide? Then you should have more vertical strips so that you can count the ones at the back and at the front together. Then you can multiply the whole sections and get a complete count. Can you move to the next slide?
Yeah, so just to add something here, there are more birds, although if you grid this up both in your mind, let's say you're looking at this in field or from a photograph, the number of birds in the back in the same grid size is much more than what you have in front, simply because there's actually much more space over there, although it looks the same to you. So it's really important, like Kaushik said, to have vertical grids alone.
Yeah, if we move to the next slide, we can see how that actually works. So if we see from the far back, the farther band, as we can see even in the image, has the largest number of birds, even though its size is the smallest. That's what Ashwin just tried to convey. Like at the back, there's larger area. And that's where the most number of birds are there. As we move closer, the area which is covered gets smaller. And so does the number. And now if we count those small patches separately, we can get to a bigger count, roughly more accurate one. So in this particular image, I'll say 770 odd lesser flamingos are there. So, which is a pretty accurate count. We are not going for the hundreds. We are much more accurate than that. So that's what we are trying to achieve by doing such kind of grid calculations. Next slide, please. Now, many a times when we encounter waterfowls, we encounter mixed flocks. Say northern shovelers, pintails, garganets, all are in a common mix floating on water, and we just see a huge mass of ducks. Or here we can see a flock, evenly mixed flock of grey herons, black-headed ibises, some darters and all. So how to go about it? Can you move to the next slide? We can count by tens. So what we can do, we can take the first 10, see what's the composition of it. If we count the first 10 birds, there are roughly 6 black-headed ibises, 3 gray herons, and 1 great cormorant in them. It's sitting if you can't see it properly, but that gives a rough idea. And with the tens count, we can actually get how many birds are there in this complete flock. So if I go by tens, I counted roughly 50 birds here. And if I go by the proportion of the 10, I can say there are roughly 30 black-headed ibises, 15 gray herons, and 5 great cormorants. I just multiplied all those units by 5. So I got a rough idea of it. Can we move to the next slide?
And to add to this is particularly useful in really large mixed flocks. For example, ducks. If you have many species of ducks together in one of these wetlands in Gujarat, for example, or in Assam, you might have tens of thousands of ducks within the same wetland, and you cannot pick each one out. So it's useful to take a small part of that group, find out the proportion of each duck in it, and then extrapolate that to the rest of the count. So just like in this smaller case. And one more thing I thought I'll add. When you have when you have a photograph, you might all think that maybe you can actually just count these one by one. And when the count is small, but usually when you have let's say multiple islands of this sort in a wetland and you're looking at it in field, then it's really useful to break it up into tens and do it. And that way it becomes much easier to count.
Yeah. Now, I actually counted the birds in this photograph and our estimates were not very wrong. Total birds were, as we estimated, were 50, while the total birds here in reality were 53. There were 27 back-headed ibis, we counted 30. There were 18 day herons, we counted 15. And cormorants, we counted 5, there were 4. But there were also 3 other species, which are somewhat hidden in this. There are some darters in there, there's 1 spot-billed peregrine, and also a house crow. So these are the few things we might miss, because in the mixed flock, there are many species which are just hidden in them. There can be one odd individual in them. So sometimes we have to take a very careful look of where these birds are. So that's also one thing we need to keep in mind. Our sampling may not contain all the birds there, but we try to complete as many as possible. Now if you're encountering an even larger flock, but you can actually differentiate different species by a look of it, you can get a rough idea of how much the flock is composed of a certain species. So in this particular image, I can roughly feel like 50% of this flock is actually black-headed ibis. And roughly 30% is of gray heron, and 18% of this flock, say, Asian open bills. You can see at the back, very back near the grass bank, you can see there are Asian open bills there. And there are a few egrets there, so roughly 2% of them. Now, what we do, we have this proportion in our mind. So we try to count the total number of birds. Can we move to the next slide? So even because this is a huge flock, I counted by 50s. So by proportion, I got roughly 150 birds in this full flock. So with that proportion, say 50% of my birds are black-headed ibis, there should be roughly 75 birds of black-headed ibis. Roughly 45 gray herons and Asian open bills should be around 27. And egrets are 3. Now, when we actually counted them out, we were again not very wrong. So roughly 160 birds, 80 black-headed ibises, 45 gray herons, which was pretty accurate. There were 30 open bill stocks, and there were 5 egrets. So even these estimates are very helpful. So since again it's a smaller flock, the error is less. But when we are counting huge number of flocks, which are say 4,000 strong, 10,000 strong, this error will increase. But again, as close as we can get, that's most the aim. So this is how we can go ahead with it. Next slide, please. Now, one big problem comes when the flocks are actually moving and there's a steady stream of birds which is passing by a certain area. I guess a few months ago, there was a video which became a bit viral of large number of cormorants moving through a riverside. So what do you do when you encounter that huge amount of birds passing through a certain area? Can we move to the next slide? We take a snapshot in time. So what we imagine is like when a bird is passing through an area, there's certain volume of birds which is passing in a unit of time. Suppose in a second or say in a minute, say 200 cormorants or 200 ducks pass through an area. Now, if that flock was moving for around 5 minutes, say for a say in for 5 minutes that flock flew, and for 1 minute we counted roughly. Can you mute? So in 1 minute, we counted roughly 200 birds. So for the whole duration, we can say roughly 1,000 birds were in that flock. So a snapshot in time is very helpful to get a total count when the birds are moving in a steady stream. Can move to the next slide.
And to clarify, a snapshot here does not require a photograph. It's a snapshot in your mind where you see some numbers passing through. You quickly break it up into tens. You make that 10 into hundreds. This is a skill to develop to be able to break these tens and hundreds out of this flock and then see how many are passing by in some amount of time. Then to be able to multiply that into the amount of time you're watching it.
So there was an amazing example which came out in 2018, remarkable checklist by Ian Davis, where Ian Davis counted roughly 720,000 individuals in a single checklist. He was at a location where birds were migrating and they were migrating through a heavy, constant flow. So in this checklist, how can somebody count 7 lakh odd birds in a single checklist? He also did estimations. And since the flock was moving, he estimated with time. As you can see on your left side of the screen, there are time intervals where he counted the number of birds, roughly saying 629 to 643, there were roughly 8 birds passing through a certain area per second. So for the duration of time, we have roughly 6,720 birds. Then for the next duration of time, 644 to 7.702, there were 3 birds moving per second. So there were 3,240 birds which moved through that duration. And he kept a very, disciplined or regular note of how many birds were flying through that particular region. And by the end of his day, he was able to come out at a total number of 7,21,620 birds, which is very accurate if you go by the estimates made per second for all these duration of times. Now, how did he come out about specific numbers of certain birds? So there was this magnolia warbler. He reported count of 1,08,200. And he gives a very good account of how he did that. So he said, among all the birds, one was magnolia warbler of the 7 birds which flew through the region, which consisted roughly of 15% of all the birds which flew. So that's his account of how he counted a total number of birds that passed through the region. And he mentioned very well, like how was the composition of the flock. Roughly like 30 to 35% of the movement was composed by this particular bird. Of the total bird seen there was 1 in 7. And how he came to that number, he said like 15% of this 7,21,620 birds were magnolia warbler. So that's how he came up to that number, and which we can consider to be very proper, and we can accept that. Even though there might be error, but this is a huge account, and yet it is fairly accurate. Can move to the next slide. So that's what. So when we are counting such huge number of birds, some birds are actually very difficult to count. But what, as I've been mentioning throughout my slides, like best estimates are useful. In this particular image or this particular occasion, there were 9,000 odd birds in this. And of course, there should be some error, but that should not stop us for trying to estimate these numbers. And we should go ahead with whatever the best we can do. Next. And even when I bird, I also have felt at times like whenever we report high counts, our observation gets flagged. But we should not be worried about flagging. This high count is very valuable information. If we are not reporting the accurate count, it becomes a very underrepresentation of a certain bird in a certain region. For example, even when we bird in a wetland called Hesagatta, we may encounter maybe 10, 15, 20 bayback strikes, but the filter somewhere says 6 is a high count. But we should report the proper numbers we have counted. What we should do is write in detail the method we count, in which we counted, how rigorous was our method to count it. And once we do that, our reports are more genuine and we should go ahead with it. Next slide. And how we can all do this? We have to just keep on practicing. The more we practice, more we get accurate to our counts. More is our like speed in counting, because I, being through this journey myself, I found it very difficult to count birds when large number of parakeets would flow through a certain area, and I would just keep on counting certain game, and then I would give up. But as we practice again and again, we are fairly able to count at least the closest number, or in tens, 50s, or hundreds, and that's very useful rather than putting an X. So that's what we should aim for, and that's how we should continue counting birds. Next slide, please. And I guess that's the end of it. Thank you all.
Some of you may have come across that there was that one exercise that was shared around on social media some time back of how to count birds, and it was a bit of a test where you'd be there were different levels of difficulty, and you could choose how many seconds you had to count the number of birds. Did a number of you do that? And thanks, Kaushik. Kaushik's presentation should be able to help improve that method, and how to quickly go through with these simple methods and count large flocks.
If you have any questions, you can type it in the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself and ask.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, Ashwin.
Hi.
So like Kaushik said, that whenever you encounter with high counts, you should properly document it on eBird. So can you suggest how to go about it? Like take an example of black-tailed godwits. We had a big flock of black-tailed godwits in nearby water body, and usually it was more than what it is in filters. So how will you suggest to put it in the eBird checklist?
Kaushik?
So I guess as I mentioned previously, so you can say how you can say, like, in a certain wetland, I divided a particular region into certain blocks and I counted with them. So you can say in a certain, I divided my wetland into say 10 blocks. In a particular block, I encountered roughly 500 odd godwits, and then I extrapolated the whole that count to all over the wetland, and that's how I came to this account. So that listing, that comment will allow the reviewer to actually assess how accurate your counting was, and that should give a fair enough idea of the total numbers.
And also it will, the reason for mentioning counts is just like how a rare record is documented with a photograph or some description of what the bird was. One of the main reasons is so that when a third party, somebody is looking at the data to try and understand the importance of a site or how many individuals were there of a species, they have confidence in these numbers that have been reported. Just like they have confidence in whether a rare species was accurately identified or not. So if you have in your checklist, if you've written, I first counted in tens, then to hundreds, and then I looked at the number of these blocks of 100 that were there in the black-tailed godwit flock, and that way I came to 2,300. And with that explanation, any third party who's looking at the data will have confidence that yes, this person has taken the effort to count this flock accurately, and has also explained how the counting was done. And that way, all of this can stand the test of time, as we always say. 20 years down the line, nobody is going to see, I mean, sadly, we may not see such large flocks of waders. Black-tailed godwits, we don't know whether we're going to see counts of 100,000 into the future. But when somebody looks at it and says, okay, this person has counted 100,000 black-tailed godwits, but has also explained how they've counted it. And therefore, effort was put in and this count can be trusted. So if someone's looking at a trajectory over time of a species, that information can be used as is. And they can have confidence in that. So that's why these documenting counts is extremely important of how it was counted. And it's not just about a reviewer, but also about how this data is going to be used into the future.
Great, nice. That's about field notes. That is good. But people who have ability to document it through photos or videos, what would you suggest them? Like if you see, they will mention numbers like 500 godwits, and they will put photo of only one good 5-star rating godwit, or they will click photo of entire 500 godwit ka flock, but you won't be able to identify a single bird from that flock. So what will you suggest?
So in such cases, the photograph is in a sense independent of the count. The photograph that people are putting are for the species. It's not really a means to explain how the count came about. So in such cases, I would encourage bird watchers to also explain how the count came about, or to take a photo of the entire flock once as a piece of documentation, to make sure that the photo of the flock, by looking at it, anybody can get an idea of how many birds were there in the flock.
Right, but the field note should be good, right?
Yes, field notes are extremely important. Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Ramesh.
Hi. Can I ask
One more question. This is Devika here.
Yes, Devika.
Am I audible?
Yes.
In the Mumbai tidal flats, there are a lot of waders which are, which land during the low tide and then move away during their high tide. The Pacific reef egret and the egrets are sometimes, the morph is confusing when it comes to the counting. In such cases, how do you handle the count?
That's an excellent question. And especially for Pacific reef egrets or for, let's say, ducks, sometimes you cannot, in the distance, you cannot make out whether it's a gargany or a common teal. You cannot make out which one it is, because in the distance, they all look similar. So what do you do in such cases? So in such cases, it's useful to be able to report them as a slash or a spur, to note down that there is not enough confidence in deciding which species it is. So what I would do in such a case, when you have a large group of egrets, I would count the number of reef egrets which I'm confidently able to identify. And those that I'm not able to, that could be, say, little egrets as well, I would call them as egret spur or a slash. So mention, although we have the total count mentioned, it's not all mentioned as reef egret. It's mentioned as some reef egret and some just as egrets. So that although the total count is there, you're only being confident about what you can be confident about. So
okay, thank you.
Somebody had just started asking a question.
Ashwin, there is also one question in the chat box, and it is by Karthik. I'm just going up to see.
Yes, I saw the question. Yeah. So it's about recounting birds, right?
Yes.
Okay. So recounting birds, that is only something that you can avoid by being careful about in field. So if you have a flock of birds that are circling in an area, for example, then you need to be really, if you're aware of the fact that it's circling, then that flock shouldn't be counted again. But if you have a group that is migrating, like in the case of the checklist that Kaushik shared, the one in US, where you had all these warblers moving through an area, in that case, it is all only in a single direction and nothing comes back. It's all mostly north to south, and you have them moving, and then you have them going further south. You don't have them coming back. So here, some understanding of the sort of behavior you're watching is important. Is the species migrating? Are they moving in a particular direction? Let's say from roosting site back to their feeding grounds. Like say for parakeets, when you see many of them fly in the evening, they're mostly moving towards their roosting sites. They're not going to be flying back. So in such cases, by your understanding of the behavior and the natural history of that species, you can say that the next flock that is coming is likely different from this flock. But if you're seeing a group of, let's say, cormorants flying across a wetland here and there, then you need to be really careful, because if just because you see a flock again does not mean that it's not a flock that you've already seen. I used many nots there. Just because you see a group of 10 after you've already seen a group of 10, it does not mean that there are 20 cormorants there. You might be seeing the same 10 again. So you need to be careful about that, especially if you're moving through a wetland. Let's say you're moving through a wetland from one place to another place where the first part is not visible, and you see a group of 10 cormorants in the beginning when you start your walk, and you see another group of 10 cormorants towards the end of the wetland, but you don't know whether it's the same group of cormorants or it's a new group of cormorants. In such a case, it's useful to underestimate, to be conservative, to say that, okay, you're only going to report 10 cormorants because you're not sure. Cormorants tend to move across large areas, and it might actually be the same set of cormorants that you're seeing, assuming the count is exactly the same. If the count is different, then it might be an indication that it's actually a different group of birds. So these are judgment calls that you need to take when you're birding. And overall, it's better to be conservative than to overestimate, because overestimation tends to have you tend to add added significance to that wetland or site. So it's better to underestimate and be conservative whenever possible.
Ashwin, Mr. Amit Sankla has some questions. So I'm just going to ask him to. Amit, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, thank you for the presentation. Actually, I wanted to have 2-3 queries and questions I wanted to check. How often do you suggest to have surveys, whether it's a season or is it a month interval that you need to keep? That is one. And when you are actually counting birds like swift or martins, I know probably you've just handled part of it, but because they are circling most of the time, it's very difficult, to use that formula of per second bird and get the accuracy on count. So how do you deal with that as well?
Okay. So I'll take both of them.
Yeah.
So your second question first about counting swifts. It's all about practice. It's all about developing that speed in counting. Because as you said, they're constantly moving and swirling. So if you're able to, what you need to be able to do is very quickly isolate a group of, let's say, 10 swifts in that flock, and quickly see how many such blocks of 10 might be there. So it's a very quick process. Let's say you have a large flock of swifts, you see one corner, okay, there's 10, and quickly, let's say that you say there are 20 such 10s, and therefore you estimate 200. So it's actually this is something that you will develop. Sometimes when you see swift flocks flying a little slower, you might be able to practice and develop this skill. But it's just about trying to count as accurately as possible, as often as possible, which will increase the speed in being able to count such flocks. So you see this many times. Flocks that are flying, it's just about quickly estimating the number of birds in a particular block and estimating the number of blocks that are there in the entire flock. So it's difficult, but it's a matter of practice, I would say. And it's a skill that any bird watcher can develop because we're already bird watchers. So,
okay.
Yeah. And your the first question, how many surveys do you need to do? If it's related, if the question is about counting, is it about counting or in general?
No, I just wanted to check if I were to, conduct surveys, be part of the surveys. I'm trying to understand, is it the season that we should be considering, or the month cycle is good formula to, work upon? Because even if you're counting certain species in certain area, I'm trying to get the two formula fit in, whether to go by the month, every quarter you should go with, or do you go half yearly? Yeah, that way.
Okay, so let's take this question separately because it's not directly about counting here.
Okay.
So feel free to contact us separately, and
Yeah.
we'll help you with this certainly. Yeah.
Okay.
Chinmoy ji, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Ashwin. Actually, it
Hi.
was wonderful. I've been doing something similarly, but now there's a perfect process that I've learned how to do it. Large flocks, taking video and trying to count each individual or maybe a little sample. But related to one question which was asked, flocks which are there in the air and you can't identify which bird. Especially for vultures, I think I found a system now. The vultures, I've been observing in a day, they hover over a place and then finally come and settle down. So once they settle down on the ground, not all settle down, the method that you gave about the proportions. Maybe same thing if you have videographed or photographed the entire flock and maybe you can divide and the proportions, can that be, also an accurate estimate?
Yes, I think so. That will work, especially with vultures and sitting vultures. That's certainly a good way if you have large
Because what is there on the ground in the particular day, maybe 1/10 of what is there in the air, but that proportion can be, used to give a proper estimate. I think so.
I agree. Yes.
Is it? So anyway, thanks. And now I'll get back to my old pictures and videos. And
Sure. Thank you.
and how important is also like we went to find the Sarkar Malkoha for 10 days in a row, but we saw it only once. So is it important to mark 0 also if we haven't found that Sarkar Malkoha? So now instead of a large flock, it's just a single bird. Say.
Right. Interesting question. Actually, somebody else also asked a similar question. Aditya Soman, when to include 0 of a species in a checklist. So a 0 count is useful in indicating absence, like you said, and if it has some relevance either to other birdwatchers in the area or to let's say something like a bustard or a florican.
Yeah.
There are very few left in an area and suddenly you're not seeing any at all, then it might be useful to put that 0 just so that other people looking at that information can then say, okay, this person has looked for that and yet not found it, and this might be of concern. Maybe there should be some further investigation, and that might encourage both researchers and other bird watchers to come and investigate that. So there are cases where 0 can be very important. So thanks for that question. There are other instances also where 0 can be put, but that's not really related to counting. Yeah.
For example, this year, last year, there were hundreds and hundreds of waders, waterfowls, but right now we've been going for almost more than a month now. They're nil, almost nil, because of the too much of rain and all the water bodies in Bhopal being filled to the brim.
Okay.
So maybe I can add 0 if I've gone to search for that. Large flocks.
You can, yes.
Or it won't be up to you.
You can add, and that actually shows that you've looked for it and yet not found it. You can add it, but even if you don't add it, 0 is still implied in such cases. So if you're looking at the data later, if you're downloading the data, then 0 is anyway implied and you won't need to put it. But for your fellow bird watchers in the area, if they see that you've put 0, then okay, they know, yes, this year there are much fewer shorebirds here, and they know that you've looked for it. You've gone to the area and you have not found it. So in such a case, it can be helpful. Yes. And this is also actually your example also drives home the point that of how inadequate the use of X is. Because let's say you have one little stint in your area this year and last year you had 1,000, and if you're putting X, then there is no difference that is implied, although there's been a huge change. So so numbers are important. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I think Nilima had a question. I'm not sure. Neelam had a question. Neelam, you can unmute yourself and ask. Okay.
Okay. And any other questions?
There are some in the chat.
Yeah.
How can we count shorebirds who fly away and again land at the shore?
Okay, that's again like the case of double counting, say, flocks of cormorants that are moving around. It's again just about being careful. If you're aware that a flock of shorebirds has gone and moved into an area, moved closer to land, and you've already counted those shorebirds, then you need to be careful about what you're recounting. Sometimes if you have two flocks of shorebirds, you've counted one, and that one goes and joins another flock which you haven't counted, then you might have to count the entire new flock again, because you don't know what more has been added to what flock it joined. So this is about some realities on the ground in field, and you just need to be careful that what you're counting is an accurate estimate of what there is there. So
Then another question is, what is the best time for counting birds and why so? Is it species specific? And what about the nocturnal birds?
There's no best time for counting birds. Anytime you're doing your birding, you can count birds then. So there's no best time. If you're doing a survey of sorts, if you're doing some a bird survey in an area, in that case, yes, perhaps morning and evening would be best, especially if you want to count birds that are flying back to their roosting areas, and to get an idea of how many birds are there in the landscape. In that case, evening would be a good time to get the highest possible counts. So that, yes, that depends upon what you're doing or what your objective is. But there's no best time. In terms of nocturnal birds, sorry.
No, continue. I think
So
someone
nocturnal birds, you'll count them like the Blythe-Reed warbler and Ashiprinia example that I gave. You're mostly going to find ones and twos. Let's say you have nightjars, you're walking along a trail in the evening, you have an Indian nightjar calling on your left, you have one more calling on your right. And this way, every single Indian nightjar you hear, it's good to note down that you heard one, and then you heard another one, and you heard another one, and either on the app or in a notebook to note down every +1 individual that you're hearing in an area. So a nocturnal counts, and you're not going to see large flocks. It's mostly by what you're hearing, whether it's nightjars or owls. It's just important then to, every time you hear a new individual, ensure that it is a new individual from a different direction, and then add a +1 to the count you're maintaining. So sometimes this process of listening to exactly every new one that you're hearing of an Ashiprinia or a Blythe-Reed warbler might make your final count actually quite high. You might be surprised at how many there are actually around you. So it's something worth keeping in mind. Around a wetland, maybe you can go through to find out how many Ashiprinias are there around your wetland, or how many Blythe-Reed warblers are there, and try and note down each one during your walk, and finally come back on the groups and let us know how many you actually found by noting down each one.
So Sanjeev Khanna has raised his hand. Sanjeev ji, if you're here, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
या मैम, जो एनुअल बर्ड काउंट होते हैं हमारे, उस पे एक थंब रूल बताया जाता है. मैं अश्विन सर की ओपिनियन चाहता हूँ उसमें. जैसे उसमें बहुत सारे ग्रुप्स होते हैं, वो पैरेलल मूव कर रहे होते हैं किसी वेटलैंड में. तो उसमें होता है कि हमें ये थंब रूल दिया जाता है कि जब भी आप उस पे काउंटिंग कर रहे हैं, तो जो तो फ्लॉक आपके पास दिख रहा है या उड़ के गया आपके पास से, उसको तो हमने काउंट करना है. जो फ्लॉक दूसरी साइड से उड़ के आपके पास बैठा है, उसको आपने काउंट नहीं करना है, क्योंकि वो दूसरे बर्डर से डिस्टर्ब होके आपके पास आया है, तो उसमें डबल काउंटिंग हो जाएगी. इस पे आप अपनी ओपिनियन बताइए सर.
ओके, तो ये एक्चुअली एक बहुत स्पेसिफिक इंस्टेंस है जहाँ पे और भी बर्डर्स काउंट कर रहे हैं. तो यूजुअली जब आप अपना सर्वेज या बर्डिंग कर रहे हो, तो आप अपना ही एक ग्रुप होगा और ग्रुप्स नहीं होंगे. तो जब आप ऐसे बर्डिंग कर रहे हो, तो जो फ्लॉक कहीं और से भी आपके पास बैठा, उसको भी काउंट करना चाहिए. तो यूजुअली जो भी आप देख रहे हो उसको काउंट करना चाहिए. पर ये वाटरफॉल सेंसस में एक स्पेसिफिक इंस्टेंस जहाँ पे और भी बर्डर्स है जो काउंट कर रहे हैं, तो ये डबल काउंटिंग नहीं होने के लिए इन्होंने ये थंब रूल बताया है. पर जब और birders नहीं है तो आपको काउंट करना चाहिए.
थैंक यू सर, थैंक यू.
हाँ.
I think that's it for today. And if you have any questions, you can ask us on our Facebook page, Bird Count India Facebook page. You can ask your questions, and one of us will be able to answer it. And we will soon upload this recording on our Bird Count India YouTube channel. On the channel, you will, if you go, there are webinar recordings and there are also short videos, which basically has a lot of different eBird features explained in these short videos, demo videos. So you can go through it. And thank you all for attending on a Sunday evening. Thanks, Ashwin. Thanks, Kaushik. And good night.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Good presentation.
Bye. And let's keep this discussion on counting going on all the groups on social media, because it's great fun to count birds. So
Sure.
yeah.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Mm.